don't have to. It's pluralistic. It's pluralistic. So. Everything goes. Everything goes.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to start with this afternoon's second session after a very rich discussion earlier. I've been instructed by Cindy to make a couple of announcements, one good news and one not so good. The good news is that there's a reception afterwards to which everybody's very welcome. The not so good news is that I'm supposed to be very strict on time, so I'll be asking the panelists to speak for no more than 15 minutes each, and sending little notes and so forth if they go over. This is to allow discussion afterwards. As we've heard from this morning's presentation by Ambassador Woods and then the panel we've just had, this is an extremely complex, the paramilitary process in Colombia is an extremely complex issue that raises challenges for actors within Colombia and outside. The subject of this panel, the role of third parties in issues for the international community, will, I'm sure, touch on many of the aspects of the process that have been discussed so far. Discussions between the government and the AUC started without international third-party role, and the international attitudes towards the process have been ambivalent, let's say, to say the best. It's been a very complicated issue for actors from outside Colombia to address. The reasons, which we'll touch on, I'm sure, in the following panel, relate to a number of basic things. The nature of the actors, the nature of the AUC, which, as Senator Pardo pointed out, is very a subject of much controversy. The precise relationship of the AUC to the state, both historically and structurally today, is the subject of a lot of controversy and debate within Colombia and outside. Then what the paramilitaries have done, their modus operandi during the course of the conflict, particularly touching on the practice of gross human rights violations, has also complicated the attitudes to the process from outside. What they want, the judicial issues and the question of what happens to their assets, the topic of extradition came up a lot in the panel before, and also what the future might look like. This is a process that we've heard that is just beginning to hit the substantive discussions of the process, and there are a number of extremely important issues that will be on the table, not least that of security, if things advance, and what will happen in the vacuum, that if it's possible to demobilize large numbers of paramilitaries, what that will mean for the countryside and the areas that they've been in before. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Michael, I've got it, Beaulieu, but I'm trying not to pronounce this in a British way, which would be to say Bewley, but I've got it wrong. And I've got it wrong. I asked him beforehand and I've forgotten already how to pronounce his name, for which I apologize. But instead of embarrassing myself further, I will say that he's the coordinator and principal specialist of the OAS mission to support the peace process in Colombia. And before this position, Michael has worked as the special advisor to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Cesar Gaviria, and has worked focusing on the promotion of democracy in the region. He was an advisor during the negotiations on the Inter-American Democratic Charter adopted by the OAS in 2001, and before that he holds a PhD in politics from St. Antony's College, Oxford, where his dissertation was on economic groups and politics in Colombia, while preparing him for his current task. Michael.
Thank you very much. It also prepared me to be called Bewley. Okay. I did 4 years called Bewley, so thank you for that. There we go. Okay. I guess I'll also extend the baseball metaphor from the previous presentation. I'm pinch hitting for Sergio Caramagna today. He couldn't make it, and he regrets not being able to be here. I'm just going to give a basic introduction to why the OAS is in Colombia, what the OAS is doing, and kind of our vision for the peace process. To begin, our participation in the peace process in Colombia can be linked back to the early 2003. During the course of that year, the Colombian government increasingly came to the organization for support in dealing with its internal conflict. The OAS responded by issuing declarations and resolutions supporting the Uribe administration and condemning terrorism. The first example was a Permanent Council resolution which was passed condemning the terrorist attack committed by the FARC at the Nogal Social Club. This took place following an unprecedented presentation by Vice President Santos in the chamber of the Permanent Council. A second example occurred in October of 2003 at the meeting of the Special Security Conference in Mexico under the auspices of the Organization of American States. At that meeting, a declaration was adopted which stated that the international community calls upon the international community to support a prompt start to negotiations and the demobilization, reconciliation, disarmament, and reintegration programs needed to achieve, in a just and transparent manner, the reincorporation into civilian life of the members of illegal armed groups. Now, that same month, President Uribe approached Secretary General Gaviria and asked him if the OAS could possibly assist in the demobilization process that was already underway in the country. The Secretary General told him that the OAS could indeed do that and would be interested in doing it. And he noted that we had experience in demobilization through our project in Nicaragua, which was the Support and Verification Commission, SIAV. That project demobilized Contras following the civil war there, and the verification and demobilization tasks were done exclusively with civilian personnel. Following those informal discussions, the OAS was invited to attend as a special guest the demobilization of the Bloque Cacique Nutivara in Medellin on the 25th of November. We were also present as a special guest at the 7 December demobilization of the Autodefensas Campesinas de Ortega in Cauca. The formal relationship between the organization and the Colombian government occurs on the 23rd of January of 2004, where an agreement is signed which establishes OAS support for a peace process and also establishes a special mission. As part of that agreement, Sergio Caramaño is named head of mission. Sergio had previously run the demobilization efforts in Nicaragua. He was in charge of the SIAF. The agreement itself makes clear that the role of the organization is to verify the ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration activities undertaken by the government in connection with the peace process. Following that agreement between the Secretary and the Colombian government, the Permanent Council passes a resolution titled Support to the Peace Process in Colombia. This resolution formally authorized the creation of the mission and also made clear that the 34 member states of the organization support the Colombian government's peace process, the peace initiatives undertaken by the Uribe administration. Now, there's some important aspects of both the agreement and the resolution that I want to touch on right now. First off is that the mandate for the mission is a broad one. We're not there solely for the demobilization of the paramilitaries, but rather we're there to support the peace process as a whole. In other words, if negotiations begin with the ELN, and it looks like it's possible that they will, or even with the FARC, we have a mandate to support the Colombian government in these talks if so requested. So if the Colombian government asks us to help, we're there and our mandate is all-encompassing. This is an important fact that's often ignored when the mission is discussed. A lot of times I talk to people about the mission and they say, oh, you guys are just working with the paramilitaries. And I say, yeah, right now we are, but that's not our mandate. We have a broader mandate. We're there for the entire peace process. Another important fact is a human rights component, which was included in the Permanent Council resolution. And I'm going to quote what's specifically said because it's important. The Permanent Council resolves to ensure that the role of the OAS is fully consistent with the obligations of its member states with respect to the effective exercise of human rights and international humanitarian law, and to invite the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to provide advice to the mission. This human rights component was in addition to the agreement that was signed between the government and the General Secretariat, and it's obviously a welcome addition. We're required to report on a regular basis to the political bodies of the organization. We have to give quarterly reports to the Permanent Council and an annual report to the General Assembly. So we have almost constant oversight from the member states. Nevertheless, the mission is absolutely independent and autonomous in Colombia. Now, the current status of the process, and this has been talked about throughout the day, so I won't go into too many details, but on the 13th of May, there's an agreement signed between the AUC and the government to establish the Zona de Ubicación in Tierra Alta, and we were present at those negotiations. Specifically, I'll refer to what the OAS's role is, what was laid out in that agreement. Within the so-called Zona de Ubicación, we will be part of what's called a Comité de Seguridad y Convivencia. This committee will have one representative from the OAS, a representative from the Peace Commissioner's Office, and a representative from the AUC. The committee is in charge of making decisions regarding the logistics, security, communications, and control the entry and exit of visitors. Basically, the internal rules for the Zona de Ubicación will be controlled by this committee. We will also be receiving an inventory detailing the weapons which are possessed by the AUC in the zone and a report on the communications equipment that both the civilians and the AUC possess within the zone. We've already begun our work with civilians. We're engaging in confidence-building measures, reconciliation efforts, and what's called sensibilización, which I have a hard time saying in English. I guess it's awareness of the process. We're going to be telling everyone what's going on, how things are proceeding. Also, and perhaps this is to Sergio's mind, and I agree with him, one of the most important components will be that we are there to hear complaints from citizens regarding violation to the cessation of hostilities. We will bring these complaints to the negotiating table through what's called the Comité de Verificación. We're the only ones who will be hearing these complaints. It's not going to be going to the AUC. It's not going to be going to the government. We're in charge of verifying what's going on. We'll take this to the Comité de Verificación, which is composed of a member of the Peace Commission and a member of the AUC and one of our functionaries. The negotiations themselves begin on the 1st of July, as you all know, and it's in a 368 square kilometer area. This fact is important because it makes it possible for us to verify what's going on. If it were too large an area, it wouldn't be a viable process for us. And this is what the Secretary General insisted on from the beginning, that there had to be a concentration of forces. As part of the agreement, we're also setting up 6 regional offices in addition to the central headquarters in Bogotá. These are going to be located in Montería, Villavicencio, Valledupar, Medellín, Cúcuta, and Barranca Bermeja. The idea here is to establish a bit of a national presence, have a footprint. We're only going to have about 1 to 2 people in the offices to begin with. Then later, if the process continues and it extends throughout the country, then we'll have a presence already there. Now, as been discussed throughout the day and has been in a lot of newspaper articles, funding for the mission has been a key source of concern from the very beginning. Thus far, we've received funds from the United States, Colombia, and interestingly enough, the Bahamas. The Bahamian donation is interesting because the Bahamas pays $20,000 a year in support to the organization. That's their annual quota. And they've given $5,000 to the peace process. And although it sounds small, when you think of it in relative terms, it's actually pretty impressive. As the process has progressed, we've also seen that the process has progressed with the ELN. We've seen that the attitude of international communities changed quite a bit. People are understanding that this is a broad process, that it's not just with the paramilitaries. And we're seeing that in the comments that we receive in private meetings. In particular, the Europeans are changing their views in a rather remarkable way. And we fully expect the Ambassador Wood noted this morning that the Swedes are going to put 1 person working in the mission. I don't think that was supposed to be made public already, but it's nice of him to say. Various other countries are also going to be donating equipment, money, and perhaps personnel, and we expect that that'll be stated in the next few weeks. So I just want to conclude with a couple of reflections on what we're doing and why we're there. The role of the organization in this process is to monitor and support. We're not there to intervene or issue public declarations concerning bills in Congress or what the Colombian government is doing internally. In fact, we're not there to tell Colombians how to go about doing their business. From the beginning, the Secretary General has noted that the international community should respect Colombian institutions and allow them to work. It's not to say that we won't have opinions on how the peace process is moving forward or that we will not let them be known to the government. We are not, however, mediators, and we do not intend to turn this into a public spectacle. We're there to assist the parties. Also, as part of this, we're certain that any decisions or agreements made by the executive branch, the Congress, the courts, civil society, will fully be in line with international human rights standards. That appears in the resolution, the OAS resolution, and we have confidence that that's what's going to happen. However, we are realistic, and we understand that any peace process in Colombia is going to be complicated. And as the Secretary General has noted, this process is a bit like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. It happens in stages and piece by piece. It's not going to be, in 6 months, we're not going to say that this is all taken care of. It's not realistic. We also recognize that the current situation in Colombia is not an ideal one for carrying out this type of mission. But we firmly believe the participation of the international community in this process can help reduce narco-trafficking, crime, and human rights abuses. We're there to bring transparency to the process. In the end, the organization realized that it couldn't turn its back on a member state when it asked for help, especially when the issue is perhaps one of the most pressing in the hemisphere at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our next speaker is Daniel Garcia Peña, well known to many of you. Daniel was acting High Commissioner of Peace from 1995 to 1998. In 2002, he directed Lucho Garzón's campaign for the presidency of Colombia and went on to lead Garzón's successful campaign for mayor of Bogotá. Daniel is now a professor of political science at the National University and directs the national project Planeta Paz. And he was also a public policy scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And first of all, I would like to thank Cindy and Joe and all my friends here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's great to be back and see some old faces, friends that hadn't seen in a while. My comments that are set in the topic of the participation of third parties will be based on a basic premise, something that Senador Rafael Pardo mentioned this morning, which I thought was quite important, is to make a distinction between the paramilitary phenomena as a whole, the big picture, and the AUC, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, is a specific military component of the bigger picture. And I think he hit it right on the button when he asked the question: what is the objective of this process? Is it to end paramilitary phenomena, to dismantle a complex historic phenomena that goes beyond the AUC? Or is it simply a process to demobilize, to somehow re-legitimize specific combatants of the AUC? And I think that the question has a lot to do with the basic nature of the process that we're dealing with. And in that sense, I think that the participation or the lack of participation of third parties, be they national or international community, has a lot to do with the questions that have arisen in regard with regards to the nature of the process of what we're dealing with. And although we know that the armed groups in Colombia, for many, especially abroad, we tend to mix, we tend to confuse the issues. I think it's important to recognize that the paramilitary phenomena is distinct from the processes that we've had in the past in Colombia. That even though the differences between the practices in the terrain, let's say, between the FARC and the AUC are more and more similar. Just a few weeks ago, you may have read about the massacre in La Gabarra that was perpetrated by members of FARC, with tactics and methods very similar to those used historically by the paramilitaries. Well, that leads to the confusion between the two, between basically throwing into one same category all armed groups in Colombia. But I think it's important to differentiate between one phenomenon and the other. Not all bad guys are the same, to use the terms used this morning by Ambassador Wood. And I think you have to know the differentiation between the different kinds of bad guys to understand what policies you need to dismantle or to deal with the different forms of violence in Colombia. But I'm not going to sit here and say that that one phenomenon is more political than the other. That maybe the traditional feeling was that somehow the guerrillas were the political agenda, the paramilitaries were not. That maybe the paramilitaries were violated human rights more than the guerrillas. I'm not going to enter into that area because I think that it's a big question as to the nature of these groups. But there's, without a doubt, in my mind, one very clear issue that differentiates the paramilitary phenomena from the insurgent left, armed left. And that has to do with a question that was also raised this morning, with the relation, what is the relation of this Colombian state with the paramilitary phenomena? And I think that is the central question. And I think nobody has ever thought that the FARC was supported by the Colombian army, for example, or that if any way you could accuse the Colombian state of any responsibility of the guerrilla phenomena, whereas in the paramilitary phenomena, the question is central. What is the role of the Colombian state? As Rafael clearly put it this morning, there are those that say that the paramilitary phenomena is simply an extension of state policy, of state terrorism. And there are those that say on the other side of things that the paramilitary phenomena is a reaction of civilian population against the lack of state control, of state authority. But if you look at either one of the two explanations, the Colombian state is in the center of the question, whether it is because of its policies or lack of policies, the question remains, what has been the role of the Colombian state? And I think that that issue is essential to understanding what policies we need to dismantle or to do away with the paramilitary phenomena that, again, I repeat, is much more than the AUC. It outdates the AUC. When we talk about el paramilitarismo in Colombia, we're talking about a long tradition of the Colombian elite to hire hitmen and to kill off the opposition. And although we didn't call it paramilitarismo in the past, we call it los pájaros in the years of the violencia. We could call it other names, but the fact is that there's something that's very much a part of the use of violence by those in power to maintain power. And I think that if we want to really look at this process, we have to ask ourselves what is needed to overcome, to leave behind this recurrent use of paramilitarism in the history of Colombia. So I think that one of the big questions that is what are we talking about? Many, in fact, in the NGO community, in the democratic left, have a hard time even accepting the name peace process to talk about this process. To have a peace process, you first have to have a war. And there really is very little evidence to show that there has been a real attempt on the part of the Colombian government, not this government, of all the governments, recent governments, to really wage a war against the paramilitary groups. It is true that in this administration, the number of paramilitaries that have been killed or captured is greater than ever before. But if you look at the dimensions historically, if you look at the comparison with the insurgency, and in fact, if you look at certain accusations that have been held, some argue that it had a lot to do more with the enemies of Castaño than a fight against the paramilitary phenomena. I think there's still a big question as to what the role of the state is. And so I will put forth the idea that if we want to have a policy that even Carlos Franco, in his statement, rhetorically states is the objective of all of this is to dismantle the paramilitary phenomenon, we have to deal with what has been the responsibility of the state. With this, I do not mean to say that the state is the only responsible of the paramilitary phenomena. We have heard today that there is a social base for the paramilitary phenomena, that there are economic reasons for the paramilitary phenomena. I think it's also fair to say that the guerrillas are also responsible in a way for the paramilitary phenomena. Had the guerrillas not used kidnapping as one of their prime methods, it's very feasible that the paramilitary phenomena would not have taken the hold that it has. But I think that this question of the state responsibility continues to be central, and it gives us a clear differentiation with other processes in the past. That has to do with the kind of process that we're going to deal with. The question being then, are we talking about a peace process in the sense of a negotiation of a political agenda? Or are we talking simply about a process by which we, using the term we use in Colombia, sometimiento a la justicia, to have people simply turn themselves in and to face the charges accordingly? I think that continues to be a big question that has not yet been answered. In fact, when the new bill that was presented with its modifications, the AUC came out in a statement and very clearly said that they wanted a negotiation process, not a sometimiento process. And I think that question continues to be such a central question, not only from the legal point of view, but what is the agenda that we're going to deal with? What are the issues that are going to be negotiated? So these kinds of questions, I think, have led, I think it's fair to say that the process began with a rather clear absence of participation of civil society and of the international community, of third parties. There was a great reluctance to get involved. In the NGO community, there were those that said that if we were somehow getting involved, we would legitimize this process that was highly illegitimate from the beginning. I think it has a lot to do with the government's attitude. The government policy was not discussed in open forums. The first the law of alternatividad penal was not even discussed with some of the close members of the Congress, close to the president. There's been a very high reluctance on the part of the government to open up debate, which is why I think that the audiencias públicas that were held, the public hearings in the Congress, were so important to begin to open this debate. But I think there continues to be great doubts on civil society and in the international community to get involved. In fact, in our first meeting with Sergio Caramagna, one of the first things he said was that he feels alone. He feels that no one wants to talk to him, that no one wants to engage in the process. And I think that has to do, a lot to do with how we view the possibilities of this negotiation process and what is necessary to deal with issues that are still, in my view, unanswered. I think there's still many more questions than answers right now, and many of those questions I think have a lot to do with this question of what kind of what the nature of this process is to begin with. I think I begin by saying that it's positive that any armed actor or any phenomenon in the violence has to be dealt with. And those of us that have been fighting and working for a long time for a negotiated end to the war in Colombia would have to celebrate and welcome a process by which the paramilitary phenomena could be dealt with. And I think that this debate that is beginning to open up has also introduced new issues, the issues of truth and justice and compensation. And I must say this from a very self-critical point of view. Those of us that are on the left began to speak of this this problem now with the paramilitary phenomena. It's very ironic that back in the days of Pastrana and the Caguán process with the FARC, no one talked about truth or justice or compensation. So I think it's important that these kinds of issues are on the forefront, but not only because of what may happen with the AUC, but because what standards we set today, whether they be high degrees of impunity or not, will set the limits for a future process. And I think that we must say that in Colombia we are a very polarized society. Those that were very critical of the negotiations with the FARC, that wanted hard sentences and penalties of the FARC leaders, are those that are saying today that we have to be very gentle with the AUC because they all want peace and we have to understand their motives. And those that are, on the other hand, are critical today of the AUC process tend to see the phenomena with the FARC in different terms. They're political rebels. They have to be amnestied. I think that this forces us to look at this issue regardless of whether we're talking about the right or the left and establish a context that's common for all. We must also say that today we're in a different context from what we were 10 years ago. We refer back to the process with the M19, with the other armed groups in the past. Today we have an international criminal court. Today, even Colombian laws have limited possibilities, for example, of amnestying kidnapping, which was possible to do in the early 90s. Today, it is against our laws. So the national, international situation has changed. But it is really with a big question that we begin to ask what has really happened in this last year or so since the signing of the first Santa Fe de Ralito agreement. And the questions that I've referred to. I think it's important to look at this question also in the light of the broader picture of the Colombian political process. We tend to overlook the fact that the paramilitary phenomena has not only killed a lot of people, forced the displacement of a lot of people, but has really attempted against democracy in a lot of Colombia. You may be surprised that, for example, in two of our departments, in two of our states, in the last regional elections, there was only one candidate that stood up for office that was given the official approval of the paramilitaries. And there was simply no opposition to the governor's race in Magdalena and Sucre, for example. There are areas in the country today where the paramilitary clearly have a hold. The mayor of Cúcuta is now being attacked or criticized for his links to the paramilitary phenomena. So we have to deal with the question of democracy, of how we not only look at reparations or compensation from the individual point of view, but how we look at this from the point of view of defending democracy. And I think there's a lot of questions that have begun to clarify. I think it's important to look that there has been a process. If you compare, for example, the first agreement with Santa Fe de Ralito to the second one, I think there's important steps. Some of them were mentioned, but there's also big questions. The first Santa Fe de Ralito agreements established a deadline, 2005, for the demobilization of all of the AUC. that simply has not been mentioned again. And it would, in fact, if you look at the interviews given recently by some of the AUC leadership, there was almost the idea, well, that was before, that was Castaño who signed that wasn't with us, and that deadline apparently has been forgotten about. And I think it's important to hold these people to what they have agreed to in the beginning and what they have signed, and that has to do with things like the ceasefire, the definition of hostilities. Someone mentioned that this morning. What are we talking about, hostilities, in a group that, by their mandate, has never attacked the Colombian state? There aren't hostilities, supposedly, as a military action against government troops. This does not happen with the AUC. So a group that assassinates civilians, that threatens people who run for office, how does that how is that dealt with the issue of the ceasefire? But I think that the beginning of the debate has been positive, and as Rafael Pardo said this morning, the second version of the law is much better than the first version. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, given that there was a beginning of a response of the international and the national community. But we continue to see a lot of problems, a lot of questions that have to do with where this process is leading to, and I would agree wholeheartedly with the idea that the new law continues to weigh heavily on the idea that it is the executive branch that dominates the process. There is not an independent judiciary or anything of that sort that leads to a lot of the questions. But I think it's also important to look at the big picture, and several of those who have spoken this morning have talked about how this fits in with the broader picture of peace in Colombia and of the political process. I think it's important to understand that the government's policies with the AUC are part of a broader government policy in regards to the conflict and to democracy in the country. We're talking about a president that is now seeking re-election, that is advancing a profound reforms that would, in many ways, do away with the democratic guarantees of the 1991 Constitution. That has to do with this question of human rights, confusing Amnesty International with Al Qaeda, these sort of things that really leads us to questions of how this process is going to fit into the bigger picture of the Colombian political process, and how this affects the chances of peace with the other groups. We all say rhetorically, yes, we should all negotiate with all the groups, with the FARC, with the ELN. The laws supposedly are open to both sides. But the truth of the matter is that until we answer the questions of how the paramilitaries will be dealt with, then we can only then begin to understand how this can affect favorably or not the chances of negotiations with the other groups. And I think that leads to the big question. If this process it really deals with the paramilitary phenomena in its broader sense, with the support networks, with what has been the state responsibility, what has been the degree, let's say, to which we can identify this with a political process, then and only then we'll be able to answer the question if this will, in fact, help us towards the future with negotiations with the FARC or the ELN. I, too, am quite happy that the ELN is beginning to reconsider its old stance that there's no possibility of negotiation with the government of Uribe. But I think it's a mistake to forget that the ELN has profound differences with the government of Uribe, and specifically with this that may sound like a semantical question. The ELN wants a political negotiation and does not want to be put on the same level of the AUC that it sees simply as a process of sometimiento, of turning themselves into the state. So I think that there's huge questions that have to do with the justice system, with that have to do with the degree of impunity. But I think that we have to look at this as an opportunity. I am very critical of President Uribe. I have very many differences with his policies, but I will be the first to recognize and accept that Uribe has unprecedented political conditions today to move forward in a positive direction with regards to the paramilitaries. He has huge support levels that are undeniable. The armed forces of Colombia have regained the initiative in the war against the insurgency. President Uribe has taken away basically the banner of counterinsurgency from the AUC. And I think that if the government really wanted to, get into a serious process of dismantling the paramilitaries, Uribe has the national, international conditions that are favorable for this process. Unfortunately, so far we have seen very little evidence that there's really the intention is to deal with the broad picture, and everything seems to indicate that we're talking about more the specific issue of demobilizing the AUC, of seeing how we can do this at a low cost, and in that sense, I would argue that this would not only not help the peace process, but will simply further the war, will broaden and deepen the conflict, and will make negotiations with the FARC or the ELN further on down the road much more difficult. Teresa is using her power here to call time, so I will leave it there and maybe with the questions expound on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I hate to be bossy, but I know there'll be lots of demand for questions and discussions later. Our next speaker is Michael Fruling, who is the director of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Bogota. Michael is a career diplomat in the Swedish Foreign Service, and his career has been largely based in Latin America and spans issues of human rights, democracy, and peace process in internal conflict. So he's ideally placed for his very difficult job. I'll leave it there. Michael.
Very much thanks, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation. The topic is a little bit key issues here, and there are several important issues, evidently, for the international community with regard to negotiations between the Colombian government and any Colombian armed illegal group. But these important issues, of which I will touch upon some of them in a few moments, are not exclusive for the international community. They are issues that are or should be of shared interest between Colombia and the international community. This is so, as we see it in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations in Colombia, because Colombia is an advanced state, a democratic state, a state of rule of law, with its problems and limitations, yes, due to a number of circumstances, not least the armed conflict itself, but also other circumstances of an even more structural nature. But it is a democratic state with aspirations to develop its democracy and the rule of law. Colombia is also an important part of and player in the international community. Colombia has assumed important rules and values that have been developed and agreed upon by the states, in particular the democratic ones, since the Second World War. These values and rules are contained in the international instruments with regard to human rights, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law that have been developed. Fortunately, Colombia has assumed these constructive international developments and made them part of the country's constitution of 91. One, I would say, of the most advanced ones in the region, hoping not to offend anyone in the public. The Constitutional Court is and has been a very important part of those developments in the country. And also, fortunately, we say, because the instruments of human rights, international humanitarian law, and more recently, developments with regard to international criminal law, are not only values agreed upon, but they are constructive guidelines and rules how to act in different situations and circumstances. Sometimes we still hear that human rights and international humanitarian law are fine, okay, but impediments or straitjackets in negotiating processes. We believe, and many with us, I hope, that it's exactly the other way around. In order to overcome an internal armed conflict like the Colombian one, you have to see to it, among other elements, that the phenomenon of impunity is not being reproduced or accepted. This phenomenon has been and still is one of Colombia's big pending problems. The so-called practice of impunity is one of those circumstances that attack and contaminate the very backbone principles of a democracy and of a state that aspires to develop its rule of law. And we often say that the beauty and usefulness of human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as the more recent Statute of Rome, are that they provide necessary and constructively applicable tools for a state that wisely seeks to establish and carry through appropriate negotiations with armed illegal groups in order to overcome an armed internal conflict. However, these negotiations have to have structure and content. There is no point in negotiating for negotiating, in dialoguing or carrying through dialogues for carrying through dialogues. And there are some examples of that in the Colombian history. Within the mandate of our office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have the task of presenting once a year an annual report on the situation of human rights and international humanitarian law. An important part of that report of our High Commissioner are the recommendations which are contained in this small booklet that has been distributed before. Here there are 27 recommendations for the country. And the good thing is that these 27 recommendations for Colombia were positively assumed by the Colombian government during the March and April session in Geneva of the UN Commission for Human Rights this year. One of the crucial recommendations with regard to the internal armed conflict is the following, and I would like to briefly quote a few excerpts. The High Commissioner recommends that the government, the illegal armed groups and representative sectors of civil society spare no effort to establish contacts for dialogue and negotiation in order to resolve the internal armed conflict and achieve a lasting peace. The dialogues and negotiations should, from the outset, take human rights and international humanitarian law into account. The High Commissioner exhorts the government and Congress to fully honor the fundamental principles of truth, justice, and reparations for victims in all dialogues and negotiations with armed illegal groups. Key to this recommendation, then, assumed by the government of Colombia, fortunately, are the following points. Human rights and international humanitarian law high up on the agenda. And also, secondly, it's very important to truthfully honor the right to truth, justice, and reparation of the victims. And here, as we see it, we have, in other words, some of the shared key issues for both the Colombian state and for the international community. The three rights that I just mentioned are crucial in themselves, but also crucial in the sense that they offer appropriate advice and guidance if a state considers to offer certain judicial benefits as part of a negotiated process with armed illegal groups. In the case of Colombia, be they Autodefensas or paramilitaries, like AUC, or guerrilla groups like FARC or the ELN. The application of these rights should be equal, independently of which one of the groups the government might be negotiating with. In other words, and a little bit to sum up what has been said so far, it is quite possible, it's very likely, I would like to add, that the quote-unquote political content of an agreement between the government of Colombia and the different armed illegal groups will vary due to, among other factors, the character and nature of the paramilitary groups on the one hand and the guerrilla groups on the other. But with regard to serious violations or infractions of human rights, international humanitarian law and international criminal law, the same yardstick should and will have to be applied. Otherwise, credibility is lacking. Otherwise, the country will not create a necessary basis for its further development and reconciliation process. Crimes against humanity and war crimes should not continue to be followed, but what make these crimes even worse, impunity. Because impunity tends only to further promote the existence of these serious crimes, and that is also part of Colombian history. There are, among other things, two important aspects to take into account without being exhaustive at all with regard to the negotiations with the AUC and other paramilitary groups. The majority of the leaders of these groups are involved in the drug business. According to very good information, several, if not the majority of the paramilitary leaders, are in reality first and foremost drug cartel leaders for personal benefits. The second aspect is the supposed supporting nature of these groups to the Colombian state against the guerrilla groups. This self-assumed and illegal role and function have led in a number of cases to collusion and links between paramilitary groups and individual state functionaries or public officials, be them civilians or members of the security forces. When such links exist or occur, the state gets contaminated and risks to lose its nature and role as a state of rule of law. The two mentioned circumstances fortify the necessity for the Colombian state and the government of President Uribe to be clear and firm in any negotiations with the AUC and other paramilitary groups. But not only clear in the process of negotiations, but consistent and firm in ensuring that any existing links between public officials and members of paramilitary groups be cut. One of the 27 recommendations of our High Commissioner for Human Rights addresses this dimension of the Colombian problematic. It does so in support of the declared policy of President Uribe that no such links can be accepted. The recommendation, equally assumed by the Colombian government in Geneva in April this year, says the following in support of the policy of the President. The High Commissioner recommends the President of the Republic, in his capacity as head of state and commander-in-chief of the security forces, to take all necessary steps to ensure that, independently of any dialogue conducted between the government and the paramilitary groups, all links between public officials and members of such groups be severed. From the point of view of the mandate that the Office of the High Commissioner has, it is crucial that the international community continues to support the Colombian state and President Uribe in the implementation of this and the other recommendations assumed by the government. Some progress has been seen, but much more needs to be done. Much more needs to be done because links still exist, and much more needs to be done for two related reasons. For the sake of decontaminating the state so that the rule of law can continue to be fortified, and also for the sake of improving the conditions so that the negotiations with the AUC and other paramilitary groups for their demobilization can be speeded up. This would positively influence the human rights situation and significantly reduce the number of grave infractions of international humanitarian law that pertain to the paramilitaries. The office in Colombia of the High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights will continue to offer its advisory services with regard to human rights and international humanitarian law. This is one of 4 important tasks that the office has in accordance with the mandate given to it in the agreement between the government of Colombia and the High Commissioner of ours in Geneva. The other 3 tasks are the observation of the situation of human rights and international humanitarian law, technical cooperation, and information and promotion. As has been dealt with here before, one of the interesting aspects of negotiations between the government and the illegal armed groups is the possibility to offer or provide certain judicial benefits if these groups and their members actively and effectively contribute to a serious process aimed at surmounting the armed internal conflict. This dimension came to the forefront when the government of Colombia presented a draft bill in August last year, as we have heard. That first version was not very much consulted with anyone, and without going into detail, we can say that the draft bill did not take into account the guiding lines of human rights or international humanitarian law. Fortunately, a new draft version was presented in April this year. This time the government had allowed for debate and to a certain extent sought advice, including from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Wisely, the government of Colombia also said that this new version is open for debate. It is a draft, not the ultimate version. Wisely, because this April draft reflects a healthy and positive development with regard to the rights to truth, justice, and reparations for the victims, in comparison to the first draft from last year. But there is still need for further developments. In other words, the draft would benefit from improvements on several accounts. And I could come back to that if there is interest with regard to the questions. In other words, to sum up, the key to peace and development in Colombia is increased respect for human rights. The necessary negotiations with the armed illegal groups should take advantage of the guiding light that the norms of human rights and international humanitarian law provide. The High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights is convinced that it's possible to seek, establish, and successfully carry through meaningful negotiations with the armed illegal groups in order to overcome the disastrous armed internal conflict. The challenge is great, though. A broad commitment is needed. The democratic forces of the country probably would need to unite more in the search for peace, on a common basis of shared values, honoring and using productively the international norms that have been developed. This would also guarantee the sustained international support for the efforts of Colombia to find ways out of and beyond the armed conflict. The office of ours in Colombia will continue its work within the framework of the mandate given to it, and we will do so encouraged and heartened by the constructive results of this year's deliberations with regard to Colombia at the annual session in Geneva in March and April of the UN Human Rights Commission. The result of the treatment of the report in that commission is summarized in the chairperson's statement, which is a consensus document of the 53 states of the Commission and the government of Colombia. And I will finalize by quoting a few excerpts from that document. The Commission continues to attach great importance to President Uribe's commitment to seek a negotiated solution to the conflict. It believes a comprehensive negotiated solution would bring about a lasting peace in the framework of good governance, democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. The Commission, while taking careful note of the agreement between the government of Colombia and the United Self-Defense Groups of Colombia for total demobilization of paramilitary forces by 2005, expresses its deep concern at the lack of progress towards a comprehensive peace strategy. It stresses the need for illegal armed groups to cease hostilities and undertake a constructive and significant dialogue. It also underlines the role that is played by the international community, in particular the United Nations, through the Special Advisor to the Secretary General for Colombia. The Commission emphasizes the importance of the principles of truth, justice, and reparation in a comprehensive peace strategy. And finally, the resolution also says, towards the end, in conclusion, The Commission reminds the government of Colombia of its commitment to take into account and implement recommendations contained in the statement by the chairperson. The Commission calls for the prompt implementation by all relevant parties of the concrete priority recommendations for 2004 of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Commission welcomes the commitment of the government of Colombia to work in a constructive spirit with the office in Colombia of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to examine the implementation and evaluation of the recommendation. And the Commission further calls on the government of Colombia to avail itself fully of the advisory services of the office in Colombia of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with a view to ensuring that norms and measures adopted by Colombian institutions are consistent with international law on human rights, and that the recommendations of the High Commissioner for Human Rights are taken into account. Para finalizar en español, nosotros pensamos que los meses que vienen para Colombia son meses de mucha importancia, de grandes posibilidades y también de riesgos. Esperamos que sean las grandes posibilidades que resultarán con buen apoyo de todos de la comunidad internacional. Gracias.
Thank you. Our final speaker today is José Miguel Vivanco, who is the Executive Director of the Americas Division of Human Rights Watch, a position he's held for the last 10 years. Before that, he worked as an attorney at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS, and then in 1990 he founded the Center for Justice and International Law, which he headed as Executive Director until August 94. He's been an adjunct professor at various places and written widely in op-eds, newspapers, articles that I know we've all seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I'm going to make... Is that working? Is that working, right? It's working well?
Yeah,
yeah?
I think it's good.
Okay. Thank you, then. I'm going to make, first of all, some comments about the engagement of the international community in this process of demobilization of paramilitary groups in Colombia, and then some specific comments about the draft legislation, at least the latest draft that I have seen, and the problems that remains, in specific problems of the draft legislation. First of all, I think the involvement, the engagement of the OAS in the process in Colombia is it is a positive development. It is a very important action taken by the OAS that should, I think, receive international support, provided that the OAS is vigilant in protecting its independence and resist any temptation to get too closely involved with the parties in this process. That could eventually, affect the credibility of the organization. Essentially, the OAS, as far as I know, the OAS involvement in Colombia is for a process of verification of whatever agreement and process and security of this specific procedure in the negotiations. Now, I do believe that the participation of the OAS in something called the Comité de Seguridad y Convivencia raised some questions or could compromise the independence of the OAS in this process of verification. Secondly, I think perhaps the main reason why I think is positive the engagement of the OAS in this process is because it helps to raise the standards, of the negotiation in accordance to international human rights standards or international human rights obligations of the parties, the state members of the OAS. So, in other words, I do believe that the support for the OAS involvement in Colombia should depend on the ability or capacity of the OAS to protect its credibility and independence in this procedure, as well as its ability to keep pressing for raising the standards, not lowering the standards to what the parties are pressing, specifically the leadership of paramilitary organizations. In other words, the even financial support of the mission should be conditioned to this reference that I just made, but more specifically, I think it should be conditioned to a crystal clear attitude of the parties involved in the negotiation with regard to the extradition, for instance, the extradition of leaders of paramilitary organizations, in my view, is the only leverage that exists in this process. Is the reason why the leaders of these organizations are taking this procedure somehow seriously. And so, in other words, if the attitude of the Colombian government it becomes, let me put it this way, ambiguous or unclear on the commitments with regard to extradition, at least financial support from the U.S. should be conditioned to a different attitude. And that condition should also cover full accountability and clear accountability for gross human rights abuses committed by those ones involved in this procedure. And impunity is not just not a single day in prison. It's also, as far as I understand, accountability includes some degree of proportionality between the atrocities committed and the time that these individuals should spend in prison. The involvement of the OAS or any other international organization should not be perceived as a blank check to provide some legitimacy to a procedure that does not deserve it. Now, with regard to the draft legislation, I should have a specific comments that I think could be helpful. And I'm referring to the latest draft that includes this creation of this Truth, Justice and Compensation Tribunal. What are the problems of the legislation at the table right now? Number one, prison time. The bill does not clearly require that individuals who have committed crimes against humanity and other serious human rights crimes spend any time in a real prison. Under Article 15, the bill states that the President will decide the place where perpetrators will serve their penalty. The Colombian media and key legislators have said that this could mean defendants might receive lenient treatment in so-called, quote, agricultural colonies, perhaps comfortable ranches on open space in the countryside. Second problem of the legislation, minimum sentence. The minimum sentence of 5 years contained in the law is too lenient for defendants guilty of crimes against humanity and other serious human rights crimes, Article 1st. Given additional sentence reduction benefits already available under Colombia penitentiary law, a defendant might end up serving a sentence of only about 3 years. The law grants significant time off for work or study while in prison. You should also bear in mind that the time that they spent in so-called concentration counts as time in prison, eventually, so far in the draft legislation. Nothing in the draft bill prevents defendants from taking advantage of these additional benefits, benefits that are available to any a defendant who is in prison for terrorism, for narco-trafficking, is entitled to incredibly very, very generous, penitentiary benefits. Who, that could certainly will benefit these individuals as well. So as I said before, nothing in the draft bill prevents defendants from taking advantage of these additional benefits. And even if it did, Colombian courts would probably strike such a provision as discriminatory. Therefore, the only way to avoid this problem is to raise the minimum sentence. 3. Individual and collective benefits. The bill allows individuals to negotiate separate deals, Article 7. In other words, a defendant like Mr. Mancuso could obtain lenient treatment even if his paramilitary organization continued to engage in terrorism and drug trafficking. This will weaken efforts to establish an effective ceasefire or a genuine demobilization armed groups. The bill should only recognize, in my view, collective negotiations, exactly like in Northern Ireland and in other similar cases. 4. Confessions, illegal assets, and ceasefire. The bill mentions confessions of crimes, but does not require it as a precondition to receiving benefits, Article 22. Nor does the bill make clear that benefits will be revoked if any confessions are found to be untruthful or incomplete. In addition, in Colombia, if a defendant decided not to contest the charges, the criminal system in Colombia, reward the defendant with what they call sentencia anticipada, which means that essentially all the terms get very, very short, and the procedure is fast, as much as probably a month, which I don't think is enough time to ensure serious, rigorous investigations of very, very complex crimes. So this tribunal that is supposed to ensure not only justice but also truth, unless there is a special provision that exclude the benefit of sentencias anticipadas, those ones who decided to confess their crimes, which is again is not a requirement, but they confess their crimes, the prosecution for those individuals are going to be incredibly brief, and it's, again, it's not a condition to receive any kind of benefits. Another point in terms of illegal assets. The bill requires defendants to pay an undetermined amount of reparations to victims, but individuals are not required to relinquish all of their illegal assets as a precondition to receiving benefits, Article 24. A revised bill should do so while making clear that benefits will be revoked if a defendant has failed to report and hand over illegal assets. Finally, on this section of ceasefire, armed groups are not required to demonstrate compliance with the ceasefire before receiving benefits. As written, the bill allows groups to receive benefits after simply expressing the intent to end hostilities. If the ceasefire is broken, benefits should be revoked, but that is not in the bill. Another point, the bill vests excessive power in the office of the president. President, in this particular case, President Uribe. The president has the exclusive power to prepare a list of individuals who can benefit from lighter terms, Article 6. The president can also reject any benefits extended to individuals by the Justice, Truth, and Reparation Tribunal, Article 12. So the president has the ultimate decision after the tribunal issue its judgment in one particular case. B, the president submits a list of judges to serve on the tribunal to the Supreme Court, which can vote only on those candidates. At any time, the president can increase the total number of judges serving on the tribunal from 3 to 5 by submitting additional names to the Supreme Court for a vote. That is Article 2nd. Another point that shows the overwhelming presence or power of the President in this procedure. Only the President can decide how and where sentences issued by the tribunal will be implemented. Article 15. Another point, crimes. The bill is not entirely clear regarding the types of crimes that fall under the tribunal's jurisdiction, Article 9 and 16. As a result, common criminals might be able to receive benefits under this law. Final 2 points. Prosecution is in the hands of the Fiscalia. Special units of the Fiscalia. The Fiscalia as it is lack, I think, even basic credibility to prosecute all these complex and very difficult investigations. So I hope that whatever special unit is created guarantee tenure for those prosecutors, so minimize the risk that those investigating these crimes are going to be subject of pressure. And my final point is about the victims. The victims are not even present in this in the draft legislation. Relatives of the victims, and the victims are entitled to fundamental rights. They are sujetos de derecho, and even in Colombian law, they are sujetos de derecho. There is no language that could guarantee effective participation or sufficient participation of the victims in this procedure. And everybody knows that most of the victims are poor peasants who are in very remote locations, and it is critical that they are able to cooperate and to participate and to make sure that their views are taken into account in the procedure. They don't have fundings to hire lawyers and to participate in that way. So I think it's something that needs to be done in whatever new form of this law takes place. In addition, and finally, I don't think it helps the victims, the statements of President Uribe when he go after human rights organizations such as Colectivo de Abogados or Amnesty International, organizations that care about victims and represent the interests of victims. And so if those victims are not able to ensure full and fair access to this prosecution, and on top of everything else, they're subject of the NGOs, few NGOs that are willing and have the courage to represent their rights are subject of incredible campaign of stigmatization coming from the president. I'm very, very concerned with the future of this procedure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that will all these presentations will open up a lot of questions. I have one follow-up question to Jose Miguel before opening up the floor. I think some of the discussions this afternoon go to the centre of the issues, the balance between peace and justice that has run through the discussions all today and how that can be moved ahead. You mentioned that you saw extradition as the one form of leverage that there was over the paramilitary leaders in this process. I wanted to see how you related that to the statement of Uribe on April the 27th, where it seemed to be that he was using the leverage of extradition to perhaps lift the possibility of extradition if the paramilitary leaders went along with the peace process as designed within Colombia. Or are you holding out for a more absolute line on extradition? There's been different views on extradition today, and I just wanted clarification on that before opening up for questions.
Sure. I work for Human Rights Watch. I don't work for Extradition Watch group. In other words, we are not dogmatic about the extradition. We are quite dogmatic about accountability for atrocities, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on and so forth. Now, if our position is pretty simple on this point. If we see a genuine effort to establish real and effective prosecution and punishment of those ones involved in atrocities in Colombia, we will not pursue the extradition. The extradition is a tool, is an instrument that help to ensure the progress in these negotiations. And essentially, if there is no chance for justice in Colombia, and if there is a chance for justice in the U.S. by decapitating these groups, by removing the leadership of paramilitary organizations involved in narco-trafficking and terrorism, and prosecuting them in the U.S., we have no problem with that. And we are very concerned, obviously, with the scenario where there is impunity at local level and impunity at international level. That, I think, is the worst possible deal that could happen in Colombia. That's why we are, we believe that it's essential, it's critical to support the extradition in this particular negotiation. But again, if there is a chance for fair prosecution at local level, we understand that is a matter that needs to be decided by the Colombian society, as long as the solution represent what the international human rights community commitments of Colombia.
Thank you very much. Questions? I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then come back to the panel, if that's okay. Can't see everybody. I can't believe that.
Hi. My name is Ginny Bouvier. I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I have 2 questions. First, I want to thank you for your various analyses, in particular, Jose Miguel, your detailed analysis of the draft legislation. My first question is to Michael Freuling, to see if you have anything to add to Jose Miguel's analysis, or if you're in agreement with his discussion. And the second question it refers to the protections under the 1991 Constitution that Daniel mentioned. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the status and nature of the reforms that Uribe is proposing to the 1991 Constitution. Thank you.
Cindy?
Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. Michael, your office has recently taken on a role not only in verifying and monitoring human rights, but also in monitoring violations of the ceasefire by the AUC. And I was wondering if you could talk about the potential for a clash of competencia with the OAS, and also perhaps comment on some of the broader ways that the United Nations role, including the role of the UN Special Advisor, is impacted by the naming of Sergio Caramagna and the establishment of the OAS mission in Colombia. Particularly, I think the remarks of Michael earlier that the mandate would allow for the OAS to play a role in negotiations with the ELN and the FARC should they mature.
Please.
My name is Marcelia Gonçalves Margerhan, and I have another question. It's in regards to Colombia's neighbors' reactions to drug trafficking spillover. More specifically, it was on Brazilian press last week that the Brazilian government is strongly considering, as last resort, shooting down airplanes transporting drugs while flying over Brazilian airspace. U.S. and other Andean countries have dropped that policy after a plane carrying missionaries was mistakenly shot down a couple of years ago. I'd like to know if you believe that there's consequences and implications to the process, and what's your comments about that?
Thank you. Michael Freuling, do you want to begin, and then we'll go to the...
Well, with regard to the latest version or most recent version of the draft bill, I could go into many of the details, but I'm not sure that it would be very wise to do so here. What Jose Miguel said is what he and I and others have said before. I would only like to make reference to our web page, which appears here, because the detailed analysis of our office was published on that web page 6th of May. And I think the best thing, if you really want all the details about that latest draft version, would be to go to this to this webpage. To summarize it quickly, we suggest that with regard to the rights to truth, there is one dimension which is judicial truth. We advise that it should be established also, or considered to establish, an extrajudicial commission for clarification of the different factors of a political, economic, military, social, cultural nature that have made it possible for Colombia to have such a terrible armed internal conflict for so long, and what have been the factors that have been reproducing that conflict. With regard to the right to justice, there are several factors that José Miguel mentioned, that we have mentioned in this statement since before, and we think that it's very important to remember also another aspect, which is that the state should see to it that those who would like to participate in beneficiary schemes, those people cannot maintain their properties. They will have to give them away or give them to a national fund of the state, which should then be used for reparations. And finally, with regard to the reparation aspect, the new version is very weak still. First, of course, the worst offenders should contribute to reparation, but in the last analysis, the state has to assume that responsibility, and that is not clearly stated. And a final point, which maybe should be a first one, is that it is only, as already has been said, the collective nature of a genuine peace process that motivates the possibilities of considering judicial benefits. The individual variant, and Senator Pardo was stressing this also, I was very happy to hear that, the individual nature could rather be counterproductive to negotiating efforts and peace efforts. Now, with regard to the other questions here, I have to say that I'm glad to be able to take the opportunity of maybe clearing up somewhat of a misunderstanding. The mission of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia, we have 4 tasks. One of those tasks is the observation, not verification, the observation of the human rights and international humanitarian law situation in the whole of the country. Observation. We do it through 4 places, Bogotá, Bucaramanga, Cali, and Medellin, and constant field missions. We have not taken on, as sometimes has been said, any monitoring of ceasefire or cessation of hostilities by the AUC. That is not our task. We are continuing, according to the agreement, to observe the overall human rights and international humanitarian law situation. In that sense, of course, in the annual report, for example, the High Commissioner was quite specific about how very many violations and infractions of international humanitarian law had been continued to be committed by paramilitary groups. But that's part of our observation mission that continues in the whole of the country. In the whole of the country. It's not a new task for us. The verification task of certain things has been taken on by the OAS. So I hope that this clarifies a certain misunderstanding that sometimes has been heard lately. With regard to the colleague of the UN system, the special advisor, Mr. James Lemoyne, I can also say that his tasks from the beginning have been and continue to be, by petition of the government of Colombia, to exercise in the name of the Secretary General good offices with regard to the FARC and the ELN. Good offices to make the gap between government and these 2 organizations less, specifically the FARC, in particular, I should say, the FARC. Nothing else has so far been asked by the Colombian government to the Secretary General. If there still are some lingering doubts, then I would be happy to come back with further details on that.
My Michael, did you want to comment on any of this, on the verification stuff and how it relates to... Yeah.
On the verification, no, not so much. On the role of the UN, the OAS is carrying out tasks charged to it by the Colombian government. It's carrying out what the Colombian government has asked of it to do. At this moment, the Colombian government is not asked, as Michael said, is not asked of the UN to work in these areas. If the UN is asked, obviously it won't be a problem. We're fully anticipating that might take place, and if it does, then we're a dependency of the UN, and there will be no problem whatsoever. That's basically, there's been this kind of perception that there's some sort of big divorce going on here, that there's a rivalry, and that's not the case at all. We depend on what the Colombian government says and how they want to proceed, and that's how we will proceed.
Thank you. There was a question for Daniel about the Constitution and the...
Right, about the reforms. There's several examples, I think, that are very... First of all, the reform that's currently being debated on establishing re-election. In Colombia, we do not have re-election. And there could be a debate on whether re-election is good or bad. What is little particular in this case is we're talking about changing the rules of the middle of the game of a sitting president. So it's a debate not so much in theoretical terms whether re-election is a good or a bad thing, but how to re-elect President Uribe. Second example is the so-called anti-terrorist statute that has been approved. That, in fact, there's an article this weekend by ex-President Alfonso Lopez that insinuates that it is going against the supremacy the Colombian 1991 Constitution gives to international agreements, international treaties, and there's a very specific elements of this anti-terror statute that goes against treaties that have been signed by Colombia, for example, giving judicial power to the Colombian military. And there's also questions that have to do with the security policy, the use of mass arrests, for example, that are in clear violations of the guarantees established by the 1991 Constitution. There were bills that were presented and then withdrawn. At this moment, there's not clear whether the government will present them again, but there was an attempt to reform the Constitution, restricting the right, the writ of protection, the tutela, which is the mechanism that is maybe one of the most interesting and democratic methods of the 1991 Constitution for the defense of individual rights. That bill also limited the Constitutional Court, that is, Michael Fruiting pointed out, has been one of the strongest guarantors of the 1991 Constitution. And so there's a series of clear examples of reforms that the government has either presented or has talked about presenting, and it also has to do with the concepts that have to do with breaking one of the basic principles of the 1991 Constitution, which is was called a Great Peace Treaty. The Constitution establishes peace as a right and a duty, and we see that in the current administration has in many ways changed what the last governments have accepted as the existence of a conflict, of a social and political conflict in Colombia. Uribe has said there is no social and political conflict, that this is simply a legitimate state being attacked by some terrorists. He has made some very important statements not acknowledging the distinction between combatants and not combatants, in clear violation of international humanitarian law that is also part of the 1991 Constitution. So we can see a series of examples in which the Constitution is being questioned. I want to take can I just to finish off what I didn't get the chance to say in the talk, which is I think that's important. I started off by saying that there was a reluctance on the part of civil society in Colombia and the international community to engage in this process. And I simply want to say that I think that ostrich view, that we just hide our heads in the sand, is very negative. That I think is important to engage in this process. To engage does not mean to simply support and to applaud. It means to question. It means to influence. I think in that sense that the call on the international community is very important, because I think that for many reasons Colombia was more interesting in the past for the international community, with the peace process, with the FARC, human rights. These are the kinds of things that are attractive to the world. But today there's a lot of questions about the peace process with the AUC, the president's security policies that have led the international community to simply disengage. And I think that is very negative. In fact, if you look at the funding for many of initiatives in Colombia, the money is going elsewhere. People are saying, oh, well, let's just, peace is more possible in Sri Lanka or elsewhere. And so I would simply finish by saying that I think it's important for the international community and the national community to engage, to be involved in a critical way, in with many elements that can in many ways pressure the Colombian government and the process. I think that the process, the bad thing is that the government and the AUC still don't know where they're going. But the good thing is that it's a process that can be influenced, that can be molded, that can be changed. And I think it's only through engagement of the national community in Colombia, of the international community, to really put pressure on the process. And in that sense, I would wholly agree with José Miguel Vivanco in saying that the OAS participation is a positive thing. It could be a more positive thing. In fact, I think it was important that, even though at the beginning it was seen as it was the Secretary General, that, as you all know, was an ex-president of Colombia, that generates a series of questions of if Gaviria was helping Uribe, and a lot of these things that led to a lot of questions. But I think it was important that the mandate was modified, or maybe that's not the right word, it was extended a bit more to include issues like human rights, to include the participation of the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. So I do think that the OAS is a very important interlocutor. It's important for civil society in Colombia, not only to support, but to engage and to be critical and to be demanding of the parties. And I think that would be a very important step to take.
Thank you. I'm just going to make one comment and then I'll take those questions. I do think that the history of the international community's involvement in Colombian peace process, it was quite late in the Pastrana process, and the number of states who became engaged at the time had a rather rude awakening to the complexity of Colombia and sort of learnt the hard way that the leverage and possibilities for influence were quite limited, and that is contributing to some of the reticence that you're seeing now, in addition to the additional questions related to the relationship of the AUC to the state, which are also coming in. But I think it was a hard learning lesson for a number of those who were quite naively keen to jump in beforehand. Yes, there are 3 questions over here. The gentleman sitting there, and then these 2 later. Mark, sorry, I didn't see you. I'm chronically short-sighted. Mark Schneider.
Thank you. I'm curious in terms of whether you all think there are ways that have not yet been pursued for the process of negotiation with the paramilitary to be done in such a way that it either encourages or does not discourage a similar process with respect to the ELN and ultimately the FARC. Is there a need to provide for guarantees against the paramilitary during this period of undertaking actions against the ELN if they become exposed because they're engaging in a negotiating process? The other is there anything in the legislation that requires the paramilitary to, in a sense, provide information with respect to their own financing and with respect, in a sense, making full disclosure of their engagement with respect to drug trafficking and other financing from other sources? And should there be?
Yes, thank you. I'm Kimberly Stanton from the Washington Office on Latin America. Just 2 small questions. From Michael Borlu, I'm sorry. Could you say a little bit, following up on a point that Danielle made, and given that the mission is going forward, the OAS mission is going forward, what the operative definition of cessation of hostilities is that you will be expecting at this point to monitor? And related to that, how concretely is the mission interpreting, or how are you going to make real the state's mandate to incorporate the Inter-American Commission and Inter-American Human Rights jurisprudence in the evaluation of the outcomes? And then just a very specific political question for Daniel. The Constitutional Court has been just a critical support for democracy in Colombia. We know that, Eduardo Montalegre resigned, and the process of selecting the next magistrate is ongoing. There's a certain amount of not that well-informed concern over how that process is going to end. And so I just wondered, can you say anything about the likelihood of replacing Mr. Montalegre with an equivalently talented and progressive and human rights-oriented justice? Thank you.
I have a short question. Tamara Tarasiuk with the Wilson Center. That's related. You mentioned for Michael Fruling, and then a related question for Jose Miguel. You mentioned a possibility or a suggestion to create a truth commission and as a non-judicial way to evaluate the activities of the paramilitaries. My question is, when these commissions have been created elsewhere, it's been in a moment in the particular history of the countries that allowed for such creation. After the end of an undemocratic rule, towards the end of an armed conflict, and I was wondering which are the circumstances in Colombia that make you think that the Colombian government, armed actors, and society is prepared for that. And to Jose Miguel, given your emphasis on accountability, my question is, how would you see the creation of a truth commission as contributing to or affecting accountability in Colombian human rights violations, the human rights violations in Colombia? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to kick off on the question from Mark on the relationship to the ELN FARC? Karen? Michael?
Well, I could dare to share a few thoughts. I think the best way, as the government has started on the road with some of the paramilitary groups, the best contribution with regard to other groups would be quick results. As I mentioned in my introduction, it's very likely that the so-called quote-unquote political content of an accord with the paramilitaries will differ quite a lot from quote-unquote political contents with guerrilla groups. Not saying that the guerrilla groups should have the type of agenda that some of them would like. So quick results, and that is what is up at stake, as we see it. I tried to say it in the introductory remarks. We think in the office that the coming months are very crucial. There is a big gap between the 9 commandments of President Uribe from the 27th of April that Senator Pardo correctly was referring to as the 9 points. We sometimes call it the 9 commandments, good ones. And the letter and declaration of Mr. Mancuso 3 weeks ago, with a totally different approach to what it's all about. Not only a totally different approach, it's really changing the nature, were it that those points would be accepted, even to be considered, changing the whole nature of what so far has been the framework for the talks and negotiations between the government and the paramilitaries. So what really is at stake, as we see it, from our mandate of human rights and international humanitarian law, because that's the only thing we are really dealing with, is that there are very interesting things to follow in the weeks and months to come. Full disclosure of extra of the different types of information, etc. No, as far as we know, no. But the point is that one of those 9 commandments is not dealing more with drugs, with the ending of the drug business, and this relates a little bit to the idea of an extrajudicial commission for clarification of history. Is the country prepared for that? we think that it would be very useful to seriously consider taking such a decision, and if the country isn't prepared for that as of yet, begin to prepare it for that. Because one has really to think through collectively, we believe, in the office, how is it possible that now entering into the 5th decade, Colombia is experiencing this type of armed internal conflict? How is it possible? And how can it be avoided in the future? We think that this would need a very collective self-reflection process involving everyone, absolutely everyone, and also with the support of the international community.
Thank you. Michael, the OAS Michael, do you want to say?
Oh, yes, Michael. Okay.
Yeah.
I think what I would address were the specific questions about cessation of hostilities and how we're working with the Inter-American Commission. Cessation of hostilities, what we're using is threats, intimidation, acts of violence. That's kind of the basic definition that we're using for that. How are we working with the Inter-American Commission? One of the great things about working at the OAS is that you get political mandates, but no one tells you how to do these things. So they do a resolution and they say, okay, you're going to work with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we're kind of feeling our way along on that. We've had close contact with Santiago Canton. At the outset, it's information sharing, it's discussions, it's working with the human rights community. We're still trying to figure out how it's going to work, and that's from both sides. There's good communication. They also have an issue of funding. They're looking for money because that's not a self-sustainable thing. I mean, they don't have money to just put into this. So the answer is that we're working it out. We're starting, and we're trying to figure out how to do it. But so far, the discussions have been very good, and the movement's positive. So.
Okay, there's several questions. Mark's question about the ELN and how this can play into this process. First of all, I think that it's the ELN. The mere fact that the ELN has changed its position, said in 2002 that there would be no negotiations possible with the Uribe government, and now they are saying this. It'll be difficult, but it's possible. I think it's a huge step that I think the government has not really understood the dimensions of what that means. We have seen, for example, that there's a sort of debate now. The government says unilateral ceasefire. The ELN comes back and says a bilateral ceasefire. For those of us that have followed the ELN, for the ELN to have spoken about a unilateral ceasefire as a number one point is a huge change in the past. So I do think that the ELN is showing that it is able to move its position to engage with the government, which I think is a positive thing. Nevertheless, and Michael Fruling was I think very, very much on the point on this. I think that is the nature of the negotiations. Is it going to be a political negotiation? The ELN has been talking about broad social and political reforms. The government has clearly said that the negotiation is to demobilize and reintegrate the combatants, which are far from the kinds of demands that the ELN is seeking. But again, in any negotiation process, the initial bargaining positions of the parties, of course, when you first begin, you set things on the table. The idea is how to bring them together. So I think there is room for change. I think that the ELN could exert pressure because I think the government, in that sense, is definitely wanting to open up a negotiation with the ELN. I think the government has understood that it can win legitimacy if it can bring in the ELN. So the ELN can ask or can demand, can be very demanding, and can in many ways say to Uribe, okay, we'll enter into a process, but the differentiation, we are going to be political actors and the AUC is not. Will the Uribe government be willing to accept that kind of differentiation? Will the AUC be willing? Which is really ironic. The ELN has been the organization that has been most affected by paramilitary violence, and so it would be ironic that in many ways the AUC process would end up strengthening the hand of the ELN in a negotiation process, but to what degree would that be acceptable to the AUC still remains to be seen. So I think that's a huge question there, but I've been really surprised to see that in very short time the ELN has moved on very key issues like the ceasefire, like negotiating with Uribe, like accepting international participation, which I think is very important. The question of full disclosure of financing, I agree wholeheartedly with the idea that truth is not simply judicial truth. We have to think of truth in a broader way, and historical clarification of the paramilitary phenomena, I think, is fundamental. Going back to the point that I began my words with, what has been the role of the Colombian state? I think that is the big question for a historical clarification commission. And unless the Colombian state is really willing to open up and recognize that there is a degree of responsibility. I don't know if it's a high degree, low degree, if it was greater in the past, is less today, I don't know. But what has been the degree of state responsibility? I think is a key question that goes beyond individual responsibilities for massacres or atrocities of human rights, that has to do with questions about state policies. Many would probably don't know that the self-defense groups in Colombia were legal between 1964 and 1989. Since 1989, we've seen all kinds of different policies from different governments that have gone from the convivides of the Samper years to attempts to negotiate now with Uribe. So I think that is a central question of any historical clarification is the role of the state. And Kimberly's question about the replacement of Montalegre, I think that's a huge question right now. The one that has the last word will be the Congress, the Senate, concretely. So it's very hard to know how that will play out. Nevertheless, in the past, there's been a lot of surprises. Many argue that with the current court, we're going to see setbacks in relation to the previous court that was seen to be very progressive and democratic. And I think we are all very happily surprised that this court has been equally defensive of the 1991 Constitution. And in fact, some of its members that were originally seen, that people said that José Manuel Cepeda was going to be pro-government, and he's ended up taking many stands that are very critical of the government. People like Jaime Córdoba Triviño, that were supposed to be the extreme leftist in the court, now ends up being many times voting alongside the government. So it's very hard to predict where an individual will sit on positions. But you're absolutely right in that given the current state of affairs in the Constitutional Court, who replaces Montalegre will be key.
José Miguel, last word.
Yeah, a couple of comments on the. First of all, Truth Commission. I mean, we support the idea of truth commissions all over the world. That's as long as it's not instead of criminal prosecution, of accountability for gross violations of human rights. The history shows that truth commissions, together with criminal prosecution, it helps tremendously to collect additional information, evidence, testimonies that otherwise are not available, and it helps ultimately to sometimes establish the whereabouts of individuals who have been disappeared, or the identity of those ones involved in atrocities. With regard to the disclosure of assets and that sort of things, look, in the latest version of this law, confession is volunteer. It's almost irrelevant. To receive the benefits of the law, in other words, to receive this very lenient penalty, there is no link. There is no relationship between your degree of cooperation with the justice. It's not a plea bargaining business, So that link needs to be established, And most importantly, it needs to be crystal clear that the benefit could be revoked if the confession end up to being, fake, partial, untruthful. And this is incredibly important, especially to protect the integrity of the whole process. Otherwise, it's going to be a joke. You need to make sure that you protect the prestige, the credibility of the judiciary in Colombia, and those authorities, judicial authorities, are going to have responsibility for investigations of these crimes. I think it's there is still hope as long as there are senators like Rafael Pardo around who have been able and willing to take these issues very seriously to make sure that as a result of the whole process, the rule of law is strengthening and not weakening. And that's why it's critically important to keep supporting this process by the international community, but with conditioning that support. It's not a blank check.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for a fascinating panel and the Woodrow Wilson Centre. I don't know if Cindy, if you want to say a few words or just... Yeah, thank you all very much.